Hey everybody, this is a quick video to review the answers from quiz 1. Just as a reminder, quiz 1 covered the contents from weeks 1 and 2, and that included the readings from our textbook, which were the introductory chapter and chapter 3. A lot of you did very well, and some of y'all struggled with some different items, so I wanted to be sure that we covered all the different concepts so that if you did struggle with anything, you can do better for the larger test, and also get your corrections done and keep those going so that when we have our final portfolio, you can just kind of be caught up with that. So let's start with number 1. Number 1 was the study of biological psychology focuses on all of the following except, and the answer there was vegetation. Vegetation is referring more so to plants, and though that might be part of biology, for biological psychology, we're more interested in brain activity, evolution, and hormones and how those relate to our human psychology. And if you want to read more about that, you can go back to that introductory chapter, and page 3 talks about it. Number 2 is asking which of the following is not one of the 3 major brain divisions. So I had underlined and bolded the word not, because we're basically looking for the one that is not correct. So rhombencephalon, mesencephalon, and prosencephalon, those are all words that describe a major brain division. So the correct answer for this was myelin brain. That's a random word that I made up. So that was the correct answer as one that is not known as a major brain division. You may recognize this table from the lectures. This table I talked about in the lectures and went over the different areas and the other names for each area. And in page 73, that was also described and included there too. So if you had any trouble with that, just be sure to review this table to know the different divisions of the brain. Number 3 was what structure is at the base of the hypothalamus? And the answer there was the pituitary gland. I mentioned that in one of the lectures, and also on page 77 in chapter 3, there was an image that it referenced as well as described how the pituitary, which I've highlighted there with a green circle, the pituitary gland is right there at the base of the hypothalamus. And this part of the brain, the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, are actually relevant to our lecture this week. You'll see when I talk about hormones in the last video for this week that the pituitary gland is very much related to hormones and the endocrine system. So be sure to check that out. Number 4, this structure, which is part of the tectum, is associated with vision. So if you have read the chapter and or watched the lecture, you would have known that when we look at the tectum, we've got 2 swellings on either side of the tectum. We've got the superior colliculus and the inferior colliculus, and both of them are related to sensory processing, and it is the superior colliculus that is associated with vision, and the inferior is associated with hearing. So the answer for that, of which one is associated with vision, was the superior colliculus. Number 5, it was a true or false question. The 2 cerebral hemispheres in the brain are ipsilateral, which would mean they pertain to the same side. So when you think about the brain and the left and right hemisphere, what it's asking is it true that the left brain is associated with the left side of the body and the right side of the brain is associated with the right? And the answer to that is false. If you had read in the textbook or heard in the lectures, our 2 hemispheres are actually contralateral. Each hemisphere is basically associated with the opposite side of the body. So if you want to read more about that, you can go to page 74 in our text, and also some of the brain anatomy in chapter 3 reviews how each hemisphere is contralateral and how different parts of the brain are associated in helping signals cross over to the other side of the body in different parts of the brain. Number 6 was about the 2 primary branches of the nervous system in general, and those are the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So as a reminder, we've got just that general idea of nervous system, and the 2 primary branches of the nervous system are the central and the peripheral. So the central is the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral are all the other nerves that are extending out to different places. So as a reminder, in page 68 of your text, there's this handy dandy figure here that I really like. It basically outlines for you that the central nervous system here in brown is the brain and the spinal cord. And then we've got the peripheral nervous system, which is also comprised of two branches, the somatic in blue, which is basically helping with the control and sending messages to and from voluntary muscles to the central nervous system. And then the autonomic is in red here. And it's in red because you can see it's more related to our involuntary muscles, such as the heart here. And so it is more related to involuntary muscles. So again, the two main branches, which break down into further branches beyond that, but the two main are the central and the peripheral nervous system. If a dangerous animal started to chase you, what branch of the nervous system would most likely be activated? So the first thing in my mind, if I was asked that question, I would think fight, flight, or freeze. And when we're talking about fight, flight, or freeze, we are talking about the sympathetic nervous system. And you can review more about the sympathetic versus the parasympathetic nervous systems on page 71 and in our lectures. If the parasympathetic nervous system was primarily activated, what would most likely happen to not be happening in the body? So I think some people may have gotten confused with this one because it's the word not here. So what this is asking is, what would not be going on? And so if you go back to the images and the charts in the book and in the lectures, you can kind of see, which I'm actually just going to scroll down to this one here, you can see the differences in what's going on in different body parts when each branch of those nervous systems is activated. So the parasympathetic, or the rest and digest, and the sympathetic nervous system, fight or flight, basically have opposite things going on. And the question was asking, in the parasympathetic nervous system, which again is the rest and digest, what would not be happening in the body? What would we think would not be happening? And the answer there would be a relaxed bladder. And so we know that, one, by going back to the lectures and in the book and looking at the differences in what happens in the body. As you can see, when the parasympathetic, the rest or digest, is activated, we have a contracted bladder. And when the sympathetic is activated, we have a relaxed bladder. And in the lecture, I specifically gave an example of how when people are in extreme fear situations, they will sometimes urinate themselves. And that is because the bladder is relaxing when that system is activated. So that would be associated with the sympathetic nervous system. Number 9 was the somatic nervous system conveys messages from sense organs to the central nervous system, true or false? And that is absolutely true. And again, it goes back to that handy dandy figure that I like to look at to explain the different branches of the nervous system. And it says it right there that the somatic controls voluntary muscles and conveys sensory information to the central nervous system. If someone was in an accident and their Broca's area, left frontal cortex, in the brain was damaged, what behavior would most likely be impaired? And the answer there is speech. In the lecture and also in our chapter 3, we talked about how Paul Broca had a patient who he noticed had a loss of speech after they experienced damage to the left frontal cortex. And so that area that he documented and observed in this patient is now referred to as the Broca's area, because he is the one that first identified this area as being associated with speech. Number 11, which of the following is not a step that was developed for optogenetics? In order to answer this question, you would have had to either read in the chapter or have watched the lecture where we talked about optogenetics and the different steps that were involved in finding optogenetics. And so that's in page 92 of our text. If you think of an EEG test, an electroencephalogram, and somebody with that cap on, and then you also think of optogenetics, it would maybe help cue you in that this isn't related to optogenetics here. Electroencephalogram cap would be associated with EEG, not optogenetics. So the correct answer here was that the creation of a new electroencephalogram cap that is not a step in relation to optogenetics. Number 12, which brain activity measuring techniques have good temporal resolution? The Chapter 3, Module 3.3 really did a good job of talking about the different brain activity measuring techniques. And something I also threw into one of the lectures was this table here to just give you a quick snapshot of the different techniques and the advantages and disadvantages. So if you look through that to this table, you would have seen that the ones that have good or high temporal resolution here were the EEG and the MEG. And these other two actually have low temporal resolutions, the PET and the fMRI. Number 13, Christopher was recently involved in a car accident. After the accident, his family noticed he had been falling frequently. And is staggering often when he walks. His family takes him in for neuroimaging. What are they likely to discover as far as damage to which area? And the answer there would have been cerebellum, which is referenced in Chapter 3 as well. It's also discussed in the lecture, but I took a little snapshot here of what it says from our text, that it in a nutshell says that it's related to balance and coordination, but also describes that it's related to a lot more than just that: rhythm, timing, classical conditioning. So the cerebellum is really associated with a lot of different things in regards to movement and coordination. But long story short, the answer for what may be going on with Christopher, it makes the most sense to that cerebellum would be the answer there. This class, so this answer came from the syllabus. How many quizzes are there with the lowest grade being dropped? The answer to that is 6. So you have the opportunity to take 6 quizzes with your lowest grade being dropped, and that was there in the syllabus. And if you struggled with this quiz at all, the good news is you have 5 more opportunities to get your quiz grade up. If you have any issues or need any extra study time or assistance, the TA and I both have office hours, and we can also work with you on meeting with you during a time that works best for you if you just email us. Number 15, which below best describes ablation? So in the lecture and in the text, we talked about the differences between ablation and lesion. So ablation is the actual removal of a brain area. So that's what the answer was there. And a lesion is where there is damage taking place to a certain brain area. So you can read more about that on page 91, but that was the answer for that one. Basal ganglia sends information from the cortex to the frontal cortex. So information that may just be in the cortex in general is being moved to the frontal cortex. So that's what the basal ganglia is helping to do. Again, in Chapter 3, it talks more about that. Number 17 was a fill in the blank, and the blank was somatic nervous system or somatic. So the somatic nervous system controls voluntary muscles and conveys sensory information to the central nervous system. Some people put autonomic nervous system, and the autonomic nervous system, the difference with that is that it would be the involuntary muscles that they are working with, not the voluntary muscles. And there's that handy dandy diagram that I like to refer back to that indicates that the somatic is associated with the voluntary and the autonomic is associated with the involuntary muscles. Number 18 was an open-ended question, and it basically just asked you to describe the binding problem in your own words. And some people seem to struggle with this, but some people really seem to understand, but I definitely wanted to review it for those of you who may have struggled with this concept. So in a nutshell, the binding problem is attempting to answer the question, how do we bind sensory information together? And binding occurs when we have 2 or more sensations happening at the same time in approximately the same place. So the binding problem is the question of how the brain is combining activity in different brain areas to produce that unified perception and coordinated behavior. So binding requires identifying the location of the object and perceiving sight, sound, and other aspects of a stimulus as being simultaneous. So basically, we're binding those things together in our brain to create a single experience. The examples I gave in the lecture are a ventriloquist. When you see a ventriloquist, they're moving the mouth of a doll, and they themselves are talking but not moving their lips. So it appears as if the doll is talking. And when you see a dubbed movie, you may appear as if the people in the movie are actually speaking the language that you're hearing, but you may notice in the details that the mouth isn't quite moving the same as the language that you're hearing. So those were examples I gave of binding, and there's a whole lot of info about binding on pages 87 through 88. And again, you can refer back to the lecture as well. Number 19 asks you to describe a key function of the forebrain, and then number 20 asks you to describe a key function of the hindbrain. So for those, when we're talking about function, we're basically asking what do they help do, or what do they help responsible for doing as far as like behaviorally, a function that we might do or see. So it could be a lot of things for the forebrain, and I sort of outlined here the different structures of the forebrain and what it might be responsible for helping with. For example, the hypothalamus conveys messages to the pituitary gland, altering release of hormones. The hypothalamus is also related to control of eating, drinking, temperature control, reproductive behaviors. Thalamus, that's helping with processing sensory information and sending that information to the cerebral cortex. And so we've got a long list of things here that you can refer back to in chapter 3, but also you can refer back to the lectures as well. There's a whole lot of answers that would have been accepted there. Some people, and you can actually go back to page 74 just to mention that 74 is talking about the forebrain specifically. Some people though put just movement only, like just stated movement, and that's more of a partial credit answer because yes, the forebrain is associated with movement. We've got the motor cortex. We've got different processes that are going on in the forebrain, but those processes are also working with other divisions of the brain. So it's not, so when we talk about movement's a little more complex than just saying it's only forebrain related. So I tried, for people who had just put movement, I tried to explain that yes, we've got different things going on in the forebrain that help with movement and signaling movement to happen, but we've also got the coordination of that movement happening with the cerebellum, which is part of the hindbrain, and axons are actually crossing contralaterally at the pons, which is hindbrain. So movement is kind of more complicated than just simply saying forebrain. And if you have any questions about that, or if that was confusing at all, please reach out to me and I'm happy to talk to you about that. So for hindbrain, again, a lot of things could have been put here. Medulla, we've got that connection to the cranial nerves, vital reflexes, pons. We've got that contralateral axon crossing. And again, this is all in our book for hindbrain. It starts on page 72. You can read it about the hindbrain, and also you can go back to our lecture. And same thing, just a lot of potential answers here. But if there was one that was maybe kind of like a gray area, you may have received partial credit. And for the partial credit answers, we did try our best to explain the reasoning for the partial credit. So, but if you have a question, of course, please let us know. Some people only named structures, kind of like I said when we first started going over 19 and 20. If you only name the structures, for example, if you just put, okay, well, the hindbrain has the medulla, the pons, and the cerebellum, but you didn't really say anything about what do they do or what's their function, then we did give some partial credit, but that's not really answering the question about function. So you most likely miss some points if you only put that structure instead of describing the functions. A lot of information was given these first couple of weeks. A lot of it is pretty complex stuff. I know when I was first learning about anatomy and physiology, I kind of felt like I was learning a new language. So it's definitely common and normal to maybe feel a little confused about some of this stuff. And again, please know that we're here for you. We have office hours, but if those office hours don't work for you, we're happy to schedule a time to meet with you. And we will be having study groups before some of the more major tests happen. And Diamond, your TA this semester, will be sending out a poll to see what time works best for everybody. And so we will be sure that everybody is able to be offered those study sessions. Thank you so much. And if you have any questions, reach out. And you can also put your questions on our discussion board for the class. That's a really great place to put questions, because if you have that question, probably somebody else has that question. And so potentially the whole class could benefit from seeing answers to questions that you may have. Thank you, and I hope you have a great rest of your week.